July 1943. In western France, the night was thick as ink, and only the occasional flash of searchlights over Le Mans reminded the world of the war that had torn Europe apart for 4 years. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The villages slept beneath the rustling wind that stirred the golden fields of wheat. Somewhere in the distance, an engine rumbled, not a German truck, not a tractor. The sound was different, heavy, steady, as if the sky itself was trembling. It was a British Halifax, a 4-engine aircraft of the Royal Air Force. On board were no bombs, but a strange cargo, containers of weapons for the resistance, packages of medical supplies, and one small matte metal box hidden beneath a canvas. It bore the label, "Most Secret." The crew knew this box was more valuable than gold. It had been developed in a secret laboratory outside London, where engineers worked on how to transmit voice without the risk of being caught. The war of radio was a war of seconds. German direction finders Funkabwehr could locate a transmitter in 3 minutes, sometimes faster. Radio agents lived as if under a blade. Every signal was a potential death sentence. So British headquarters searched for a solution: how to speak with operatives in France without revealing their location. The answer was the S-phone, a system that allowed for directional communication between an aircraft and an agent on the ground. A radio that didn't shout into the ether, but whispered in the right direction. The pilot, RAF Lieutenant William McRae, checked the coordinates. Altitude 2,000 meters. Time 01:42. In his headphones, a short signal, a dot and 2 dashes. It was the ground operator's code. The drop zone was clear. He gave the command, "Container to drop." The mechanic opened the hatch, and the metal cylinder slipped away, carrying with it the latest marvel of British science. The parachute opened with a snap, its silver fabric catching the moonlight for a moment before vanishing into the darkness. On the ground, at the foot of an old windmill, stood a man in a grey coat. His name was Pierre Lemaitre, 32 years old, a former schoolteacher from Rouen, now an agent of the resistance. He worked for the SOE Special Operations Executive, a British organization that officially did not exist. Even in reports, it was referred to as Section X. In Pierre's hands was a compact device, a field radio disguised as a suitcase. But tonight, he wasn't using the old equipment. Tonight, he had a new device, one that would change everything. He retrieved the cylinder from the ground, brushed off the damp clay, and connected a wire to a small directional antenna, resembling a tripod with metal whiskers. He set it up, angling it toward the sky. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from focus. Somewhere above was the aircraft, and he had exactly 2 minutes to establish contact. The enemy's direction finders were not idle. 30 kilometers away, in the city of Tours, a German van with antennas was scanning the airwaves for the faintest impulse. One wrong click, and by morning he would be captured. Pierre pressed the button. In his headphones, static, crackling. Then a voice, quiet with a British accent. "This is Eagle. Do you read?" "I hear you," he replied. "The field is clear. You may drop." The conversation lasted less than a minute. No unnecessary words. Only coordinates, confirmations, and a brief, "Roger." Then the connection cut off. He looked up and saw a small parachute descending from the darkness. The container landed in the field, almost silently. Inside were medical supplies, instructions, and a new codebook. Everything had gone perfectly. Pierre switched off the device, quickly buried it in the earth, and covered it with grass. He knew this was no ordinary radio. its signal could not be intercepted. It was directional, like a flashlight beam, vanishing into the sky without touching a single enemy antenna. Later, the British would call the S-phone one of the safest communication tools of the Second World War. It allowed agents to survive where ordinary radios meant certain death. For the first time, a spy could speak directly to a pilot without fear of being overheard. That night, among the fields and stars, Pierre felt for the first time that the resistance had a chance. A radio that didn't shout but whispered. A whisper that saved lives. A whisper that flew through the war. World War II is often remembered as a war of steel tanks, guns, aircraft. But the real battle was fought in the air, invisible and relentless, in the realm of radio waves. Where gunfire was replaced by short bursts of signal, and death came not from the front, but from the ether. Radio was a double-edged blade. It could save and it could kill. As early as 1940, the Germans realized that the resistance could be fought not only with weapons. In Berlin, they created a special unit called Funkabwehr, radio counterintelligence. These men did not wear the uniforms of frontline soldiers, nor did they charge into battle. They sat in vans, surrounded by instruments, headphones, and flickering indicator needles. Their weapon was silence. All of Europe, from Paris to Warsaw, became their hunting ground. When an agent somewhere in France switched on a radio transmitter, German operators marked the frequency, determined the signal's direction, and within minutes could pinpoint the location on a map. Then came arrest, interrogation, disappearance. In 1942 alone, more than 400 resistance radio networks were destroyed in France. Radio agents were hunted like fireflies in the dark. They knew the ether did not forgive mistakes. One slip 10 minutes and you were dead. Everyone who held a transmitter lived on the edge of the moment. Many were former teachers, engineers, translators, not soldiers, but people who became martyrs for a single signal, for the words "drop successful" or "target confirmed." The British understood, without reliable communication, the resistance would not survive. Transmitting orders, receiving intelligence, coordinating weapon drops, all of it required radio. But every contact cost lives. Standard sets like the B-2 and Type 3 Mark II, though compact, operated on wide bands, and the Germans quickly learned to intercept them. That's when debates began in the headquarters of SOE and the RAF. What mattered more, the strength of the signal or its invisibility? The answer came not from generals, but from engineers. In the basement of a research center in Hensley, a group of young specialists experimented with directional transmission. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Why broadcast in all directions when you could aim the signal straight upward to where the aircraft was flying? Thus was born the concept of the S-phone system that allowed a pilot and an agent to speak directly without wide dispersion of radio waves. It was not just a radio. It was a narrow beam, like a telephone line between sky and earth. German direction finders could sit nearby and hear nothing. The S-phone left no trace in the ether. Every second of conversation was strictly limited. Everything was written in the instructions. No more than 30 seconds of transmission. Do not repeat the signal. Afterward, immediate shutdown. The war in the ether was like chess. Every move a risk. An agent entered the airwaves as if placing his life on the table. He could not see the enemy, but he could feel its breath. Funkabwehr moved fast. Their vans, equipped with cross-shaped antennas, roamed the roads of France, scanning the sky. When three such vehicles converged, their antennas formed a triangle, and at its center was the agent. To survive, one had to remain silent, sometimes for weeks. Radio agents lived in apartments with thick walls, transmitted at night under the roar of aircraft engines, so the noise would mask the signal. They encoded messages in notebooks, where each letter was replaced by a number. Sometimes they hid antennas in laundry, sometimes in crutches. Some said that when you switched on the transmitter, time began to flow differently. The world shrank to the crackle in the headphones and the flicker of a bulb. These people became invisible soldiers, rarely mentioned in reports, yet without them there would have been no weapon drops, no coordinated resistance strikes. They were voices from the darkness, and when the Allies realized they needed to protect those voices, they created the S-phone. From that moment, the ether ceased to be a trap. It became a weapon. Now a pilot could speak to an agent during flight, and not a single German radio van would hear a word. It was the first victory in a war without gunfire, a war won by silence. In one of the old manor houses of Buckinghamshire, where once there had been balls and poetry readings, music no longer played in 1942. The windows were boarded up, guards patrolled the grounds, and a sign hung on the gate. No entry, Ministry of Supply. This was the birthplace of a new branch of warfare, a war of engineers, scientists, and radio technicians. Here, in the laboratories of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, a communication system was being born. One so secret that even Churchill didn't know about it. The S-phone. The creator of this technology, James Browning, was not a hero in the conventional sense. No uniform, no medals. Always with stained hands and glasses slipping down his nose, he spent days and nights among coils, tubes, and wires. His inspiration came from despair. Too often he heard radio reports of agents who had died, those who had been located by their signal. Every lost transmitter meant not just failure. It meant the death of someone who had trusted in an invisible link to London. The idea of the S-phone was both mad and brilliant. To make radio communication directional, like the beam of a flashlight, rather than a torch lighting up the entire forest. It seemed impossible. Radio waves are not beams. They cannot be aimed. But the engineers decided to use a combination of ultra-short waves and directional antennas that would literally shoot the signal upward toward the aircraft. To understand how revolutionary this was, one must recall how a standard radio worked at the time. An agent transmitted on a frequency that spread in all directions. The Germans, with direction-finding vans stationed dozens of kilometers away, could instantly detect the source. The S-phone, however, emitted such a narrow beam that if the aircraft shifted even a kilometer off course, the signal would vanish. This made the transmission nearly invisible, ephemeral, like a whisper in a storm. The system consisted of two parts: a ground unit for the agent, housed in a suitcase weighing about 15 kilograms, and an airborne transceiver installed in the aircraft. It operated at around 300 megahertz of frequency range, where signals did not bounce off clouds and could not be intercepted by German direction finders. Standing in a field, the agent aimed the antenna skyward, and his voice literally pierced the sky, landing directly in the pilot's cockpit. They could speak directly, not in cipher, not in code, but in plain words. Cargo received. Depart. Understood. Good luck. It was unheard of. Until that moment, the agent on the ground and the pilot in the sky had existed in separate worlds. Now, A living thread connected them. The tests were conducted in complete secrecy. The laboratory where the system was trialed was located in the basement of an old hospital. Instead of agents, students, and volunteers from the local aero club were used for the trials. They laughed when they first heard a voice from the sky, as if God himself had answered from the clouds. But behind that moment were years of calculations, experiments, and failures. Sometimes antennas burned out, radio tubes exploded, and signals vanished without a trace. But Browning never gave up. He recorded every mistake, drew new schematics, soldered through the night, and tested again. By spring 1943, the S-phone was ready. At a demonstration for representatives of the RAF and SOE, Lord Menzies himself, the head of British intelligence, was present. An agent stood in a field where sheep grazed, raised the antenna, and suddenly a voice came from the sky. "London calling. Do you hear me?" "Clear as a bell," the agent replied. Everyone froze. A radio that could not be intercepted. A voice heard by only one person. Churchill would later call it Britain's quietest weapon. A war that had seemed a contest of muscle and guns had suddenly become a war of invisible signals, and on that battlefield, Britain intended to win. The S-phone became a secret, known only to a select few. It was never mentioned in reports, never listed in supply manifests. Even among agents, rumors circulated, "London's new ear, the whisper from the clouds." To some, it was a technical miracle. To others, the last hope of survival. But the journey from laboratory to real combat was still ahead. The true test of the S-phone awaited not in the quiet hills of England, but in the dead shadow of occupied Europe, where every sound could cost a life. The night of June 5th to 6th, 1944. England breathed with the storm. At the Tempsford airfield, in the grey pre-dawn mist, aircraft stood with large crosses on their wings, not German, but Allied markings for night missions. These planes carried not bombs, but people, those who jumped into darkness to ignite the light of resistance in occupied Europe. Among them was the French courier Marie Duval, an agent of the Jedburgh network. Her task was simple only on paper: to meet a group of Allied saboteurs deep inside France and guide them to the location where one of the first operations using the S-phone system was to take place. The pilot of the Halifax aircraft, Captain William Murray, sat with headphones on, checking the new instruments. On the panel was a strange metal box marked in white letters. S-phone, secret. The device was a novelty. Even among the crew it was called the Miracle with Wires. It was supposed to allow him to communicate directly with the agent on the ground, without radio ciphers, without delays, without the risk of signal interception. Everything depended on trust. No one had yet used the S-phone in real combat. No one knew if it would withstand engine noise, atmospheric interference, and the fear that paralyzes even the most experienced hands. Marie jumped into the sky as the aircraft passed over the outskirts of Chartres. Below her, endless darkness of French meadows, above stars like cold lanterns of God. The wind tore at her breath, the parachute opened with a snap, and for a moment the world stood still. When she landed, the earth felt too quiet. Even the cicadas seemed to know this night was not ordinary. She dug up the equipment container and found inside the metal case the very S-phone. It weighed just under 20 kilograms, but at that moment it felt heavier than artillery. The system had to be assembled in 3 minutes, or the risk of detection became fatal. She unfolded the antenna, set up the tripod, and turned the top plate precisely north toward the path the aircraft was expected to fly. On the frequency silence. 1 minute passed, then 2, and suddenly a short crackle. A voice, barely audible, as if someone were whispering through water. "This is Eagle. Marie, are you on the line?" "Yes, I hear you," she replied, suppressing a tremble. "The sight is clear. You may proceed." A second of silence. "Understood. Container inbound." On the horizon, a faint glimmer appeared. A parachute carrying a load of weapons and radio components for the French underground. The container landed softly, and Marie ran toward it, hiding the S-phone beneath her cloak. When she later wrote her mission report, the phrase was brief. "Signal stable. Delivery successful. No losses." But behind those words lay a miracle. For the first time in the entire war, an agent and an aircraft communicated not through risky radio signals, but directly, as if they were standing side by side. Not a single German antenna caught the conversation. No direction finder reacted. To the enemy, the ether remained dead. A week later, a similar operation took place near Nancy, then in the Ardennes, and finally in Normandy, where the S-phone helped coordinate actions between the resistance and Allied forces. In one report, General Eisenhower personally noted that the new radio system reduced errors during night drops to nearly zero. The S-phone became a voice heard only by those it was meant for. It did not roar, did not flash, did not leave traces, but it is often such things that change the course of war. Soldiers and agents said that on those nights, the sky seemed to listen to them. They knew somewhere above the clouds was a pilot who heard their whisper and responded briefly, precisely, to the point. And that feeling of connection, of almost human closeness, helped them survive when the world around them was falling apart. June 6th, 1944. Normandy breathed gunpowder and screams. The sky, stitched together by searchlights and tracer rounds, roared like a living thing. The world stood on the brink of a new era, and somewhere between sky and earth, among the thousands of sounds of war, a voice was speaking. A voice heard by no one except those for whom it was intended. A voice traveling through the channel of the S-phone. The system, invented by British engineer Harold Roberts and perfected by specialists of the SOE, was being used for the first time in a large-scale operation. Its goal was both simple and impossible: to connect sky and ground in conditions where any radio wave could cost lives. Dozens of agents scattered across occupied France were tasked with coordinating the landing of Allied forces, guiding paratroopers, and reporting on German positions. All in a silence that even the most sophisticated listening devices of the Wehrmacht could not penetrate. At dawn, RAF Captain John Talbot sat in the cockpit of a Dakota transport aircraft, waiting for a signal. His instrument panel glowed with a soft blue light. On his lap lay a metal unit, the S-phone Muxasad. The device resembled something between a field telephone and a miniature receiver. Two antennas, one pointed downward into the night, the other forward, as if showing the way. In his headphones, static, then silence, and then, "This is Swallow. I see you. Northwest, field beyond the village of Tourville. All clear." Talbot nodded, though no one could see it. He leaned toward the microphone. "Understood. Stay clear of the road. Drop in 2 minutes." A thin thread of ether connected him, sitting 1,000 meters above ground, and a young French woman below, hidden among stalks of wheat. Her name was Jacqueline Moreau, 22 years old, a courier for the resistance. Just a year earlier, She had been writing letters to her parents from the Sorbonne. Now she held in her hands a metal box capable of altering the fate of the invasion. She heard the hum of propellers low, vibrating as if the sky itself trembled in alarm. "I see you," she whispered, watching the dark mass of the aircraft glide above the forest. "Package inbound," came the voice in her headphones. 3 containers dropped from the sky, their white parachutes opening. One struck the ground close to her, nearly grazing her shoulder, but remained intact. Inside radio components, Sten submachine guns, several explosives, and most importantly spare batteries for the S-phone. This connection changed everything. Previously, resistance agents transmitted bombing coordinates through lengthy encrypted radio messages, which German stations could triangulate within minutes. Now, with the S-phone, British pilots received real-time information directly above their targets. They knew where it was safe to land, where the enemy was, and where their allies were. In one such operation near Caen, on the night of June 7th, the S-phone saved dozens of lives. A group of paratroopers, having veered off course, found themselves above marshland. Contact with the ground had been lost. The commander was preparing for an emergency drop when a signal came through quiet but confident. "This is Swallow. Marshes ahead. Turn 15 degrees west. I repeat west." Talbot adjusted course. 3 minutes later, his instruments showed a new landmark, a dry field. The drop was successful. Not a single life was lost. Later, in the mission report, it was noted. Communication via S-phone ensured 98% landing accuracy. It was not just a success. It was proof that even in the chaos of war, the discipline of technology and human trust could operate in harmony, like heartbeat and breath. Jacqueline later said that Talbot's voice became for her the voice of the sky. Not of God, not of a soldier, but of a person who heard her and responded. "When I heard that crackle," she recalled, "I knew the world hadn't collapsed. Up there, someone knew we existed." This connection, almost intimate in its simplicity, became a symbol of how technology can not only coordinate armies, but preserve humanity. The S-phone never became a legend like the Enigma or Churchill's radar. Its name was rarely mentioned in textbooks, but without it, Normandy might have become another disaster. Sometimes the greatest inventions don't make noise, they whisper. When the guns fell silent and the smoke over Normandy began to clear, the airwaves, once crackling with orders, signals, and whispers, sank into a strange, almost painful silence. Allied radio stations still operated, but now the voices on the waves belonged not to agents and pilots, but to commissions, protocols, and the occasional human phrase, "Operation complete. Return home." For Jacqueline Moreau, that home sounded hollow. Paris had been liberated, but there was no home left there, no parents, no friends. She lived between the lines of history, between those who fought and those who survived. In the bag she carried was the very same S-phone antenna, no longer functional, its casing cracked. A talisman, a memory of the voice that had saved her life. In London, Captain John Talbot sat at a desk in the grey building of the Ministry of Aviation, staring at a stack of reports. He didn't know what to do with the silence. After months of hearing short, tense phrases every night, "Field is clear. Cargo delivered. Bombing complete." The absence of sound felt like torture. He remembered that voice with an accent female, steady, fearless. Jacqueline's voice. They had never met. Their conversations lasted seconds, and yet Talbot was certain he knew her better than many he saw every day. Their connection was strange, almost outside of time. "She called the aircraft," he responded. Two people separated by sea, war, and fate, joined by a thin radio wave that lasted only as long as a whisper of trust. When the war ended, the S-phone was officially decommissioned. Hundreds of units were dismantled, destroyed, archived under the label classified, obsolete. But the engineers knew it was not the end. S-phone technology became the foundation for early mobile communication systems, targeting systems, and even the first satellite communication channels in the 1950s. History moved forward, but memory remained. In 1947, at the Science and Resistance exhibition in Paris, among radios, motorcycles with secret compartments, and forged passports, a small grey box with antennas stood on a separate table. The plaque beneath it read, "S-phone, Allied Agent-to-Aircraft Communication System, United Kingdom, 1943-1945. Visitors passed by without stopping. The box looked dull, devoid of romance, but one woman paused. Young, in a modest coat, with a tired gaze, Jacqueline Moreau. She ran her finger across the cold metal and quietly said, "It spoke." On the wall behind the exhibit hung a photograph of Foggy Field, a night aircraft above it. Caption, "Unknown communication point, Normandy, June 6, 1944. Jacqueline smiled. She knew that point. She had stood there. Somewhere that same year, Captain Talbot received a letter with no return address. Just one page, written in neat handwriting. "I heard your voice on the most terrifying night of my life. You said, 'Stay clear of the road.' I listened. Because of that, I'm alive. Thank you. J." The letter remained in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. Decades later, when journalists wrote books about the war, they rarely mentioned the S-phone. They spoke of Bletchley Park, of flying fortresses, of Churchill. But in the archives, among yellowed pages, there is a report with a dry line. S-phone radio communication enabled successful coordination of 72 out of 76 SOE night operations in France. Casualties minimal. And below it, a small note from a communications officer. Technology works when people trust it. Jacqueline died in 1991. Among her belongings was the same S-phone casing, carefully wrapped in cloth. Beside it, a photograph of a young British pilot in RAF uniform, unsigned. The S-phone didn't save the world. It didn't win the war. But it became a voice that passed through chaos, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that even amid the sounds of death, one can build a connection founded on faith and humanity. The airwaves no longer crackle. But if you listen closely to old recordings, somewhere in the static you can still hear, "This is Swallow. I see you. All clear." After Germany's surrender, the fate of the S-phone could have been mundane blueprints shelved in archives, devices placed in museums. But in the post-war world, where former allies quickly became rivals, anything that carried even a hint of secrecy was given a second life. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, was disbanded, but its legacy did not disappear. Several engineers who had worked on the S-phone joined the newly established MI6, developing communication systems for intelligence officers now operating in Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. Only now the enemy was no longer the Wehrmacht, but the KGB. The S-phone, of course, was outdated, too bulky, too analog. But its principles remained invaluable. A directional beam that could not be intercepted. A frequency that eluded conventional listening devices. These ideas inspired engineers to create new devices, such as the C-42 compact radio sets that used modulation on the edge of audibility. Their signals vanished into the ether like whispers in the wind, and it was precisely this whisper that became the foundation of NATO's future covert communication networks. Meanwhile, former S-phone operators' agents, couriers, radio operators returned to ordinary life. Some opened cafes, some became physics teachers, some simply disappeared, as was fitting for people accustomed to silence. Only occasionally, when a faint crackle passed through a radio, they would look up and pause for a moment. In that sound lived their past. The S-phone became a symbol of invisible victory, not the kind that echoes in parades, but the kind that saves thousands while remaining in the shadows. Its wireless voice remained in history as a reminder. Sometimes the loudest weapon is the silence that connects.